Educar para la vida es amar el mundo, las otras especies y a la naturaleza. Es dejar el mundo en las mejores manos.
Welcome and thank you for
Buenos días. Gracias por la introducción amable. Soy muy feliz de estar con vosotros, pero mi español es muy débil, por eso hablé en inglés. Pero la PowerPoint es, al menos los títulos son también en español. Un momento. ¿Es visible para todos?
Yeah, Professor, we can see now your presentation.
Muy bien, muy bien. El título, como has dicho, Education for Homeland Earth, Educación para la Tierra Patria, y Educación para la Paz como Educación para la Ciudadanía Mundial y Planetaria. I will speak about 4 points. First, some general reflections on the question of education. Secondly, what is the idea of Homeland Earth, drawing from Professor Edgar Morin from France. And then I will focus really on my topic of peace and global citizenship education. And finally, in a more practical way, to draft at least 3 ways how to deal with this transformative peace and global citizenship education. But since you said I should introduce myself, I would show you who I am. That's me, but this is not a very simplistic drawing of a person. This is a geographical map, definition of who I am, because it explains where I am. I'm here in this small city of Villach in Austria, and this is on a border triangle between Austria, Italy, Slovenia, and here very close the Mediterranean Sea. And this is important for my work and for my identity as a peace educator, as an emeritus professor of University of Klagenfurt in my region, and one of the leaders of the master's program of global citizenship education. And when I say I'm dealing with the global, I do this in a very local way as well, dealing with this very interesting triangle between 3 countries that had waged war in the past and now are living together. And there is still some memory issues, memory politics, as you have it also in Latin America, for instance. So just to give you an idea of my background in some way. Okay, I will focus directly on limits and power edification, because I see very often that if there's is there a problem in society and society is unable to solve the problem, then they always call for education. If there's war and violence, they speak about peace education. Now we have this climate change and this disaster in the Glasgow but they're speaking about education for sustainability. Is there anything? Is there any problem? No.
Go ahead, Professor. We hear you perfectly.
Okay, because I heard somebody thought it's a problem with the transmission. Okay, no, and so on. With all these crises, people is always asking for the solution via education. But of course, education cannot be an excuse for all other activities that they are missing. And education cannot solve the problems that the politicians are not willing or not able to solve. However, I believe that education has an important role to play, even if it cannot replace politics. We have to be aware that a deep change in society cannot be done only by politics. It has always been accompanied by a deep cultural change. And this deep cultural change can politics can lay the ground for with laws for better possibilities. But the cultural change is a matter of education in a very wide sense of the word education. It's a kind of self-education, of course, also. And so I believe that if we're speaking about peace, for instance, we have the idea of a culture of peace as a missing link between the individual and the political. The individual alone being peaceful will never lead to a peaceful society, but neither the politics can create a real free and peaceful society. It always needs what I call a culture of peace. I quote here Maria Montessori, who said, "Establishing lasting peace is the work of education. All politics can do is keep us out of war." So I think this is important to keep in mind when we speak about any kind of political education in a wide sense. Another difference is maybe important, and I draw here from the US-American peace educator Betty Reardon, who speaks about formative and transformative in education. And she said, education is is always more or less formative. They want to form citizens in a certain way, but learning is transformative. When we learn, we change. And this is very important to understand that teaching alone is not enough. Learning is a real transformation process. And learning has to be transformative in order to transform a society, which is urgently needed today. And I think this is also the idea of educar para la vida, this idea. I would like to make a distinction between three different aspects or dimensions of what I call transformative learning. This is a change in individual perspectives of meaning. And this is much more than to learn something, new knowledge, for instance. It's more an inner revolution, if you want, of your basic assumptions of thinking, feeling, and acting. It's a different understanding of yourself or of your relationship with others and so on. The second dimension, I guess, in Latin America especially, you understand this very well, is the collective process in the sense of Paulo Freire, who always spoke about of change in the sense of not only changing the individual, but the whole society has to become aware, the conscientization, as Paulo Freire said. And the third point, and you should never forget, even if this is not really the work of education itself, but it is the directions that education should lay the ground. This is changing cultures and structures. Structures that hinder emancipatory learning and change in the education system and the social change in general, of course. So we have to keep this in mind when we speak about transformation. And I guess we all agree about the necessity today of a great transformation. On the left, you see that I have different notions to compare, and I prefer a word like transformation or metamorphosis to the word of transition or revolution, and of course also compared to reform, because reform is not strong enough, it's not radical enough, and revolution very often is a word that believes you can make tabula rasa, change all things, but not really taking care if there is some things that you still need and some things that you keep and some other things that you have to change. So I think also this word of metamorphosis is very strong and very a good expression because it means to change the existing material into something new with a new quality. And this comes like some other ideas, and especially the concept of Homeland Earth from French philosopher Edgar Morin. He wrote a book on Homeland Earth, and he said that this should be the direction of all further thinking of a change. In his analysis, he said we are living now in what he calls an iron planetary era. This means the world is already relatively globalized, but it's globalized in a very negative way. Still, the continuation of old colonialism and neo-colonialism, violence, destruction, all this, what Mignolo calls the darker side of Western modernity, is still here with all the problems. And now we are even in a more difficult situation, what Morin calls the Damoclean era. And this means we're living in a polycrisis of the planet Earth. Everybody knows about the economic disorder, the lack of democracy in most parts of the world, the threat of a nuclear war, even if they do not speak so much about this, and of course, all these ecological catastrophes that are really a menace for the surviving of many species and also of humankind itself. As for the deeper reasons, there is not only a crisis of the capitalist system, which is obvious, but it's also a crisis, what Morin calls a crisis of human hubris, believing that humans can create and recreate the nature in their will. A third point is, of course, patriarchic structures and cultures. And finally, also our way of thinking is much too fragmented. I will speak about this a little later. So you find all this in this book, Tierra Patria, for instance, which is for free, at least the Spanish version. But Morin gives us also a perspective, and he said, the fact that we are in this polycrisis should make us aware of our common terrestrial fate, of humankind who is not unified, but who can be aware of their pluriversality. And in this sense, maybe it is possible to understand that humanity's common destiny is also dependent on the destiny of the planet Earth itself. So we are in a situation where we will perish, or we will be able to make a qualitative leap, what Morin calls the civilization of the civilization. Be aware, the common terrestrial fate doesn't mean that there are no difference between people, so that humanity is united. This is not the case. You see it every day. There's still a need, and a very important need, to fight against all the forces that keeps the systems that leads us into the abyss. And I guess discussion in Glasgow and the very disappointing way the leaders of the states are discussing now is a good example for this. Okay, I come now to this aspect of metamorphosis. Always a quotation of Morin: what matters is to turn the human species into humanity, civilization of the civilization, and the planet Earth into a common home for human diversity. This needs a reform in our way of thinking, a reform in our way of educating, and a reform in all matters of organization of our society. Morin, he has a very wide perspective, and he speaks about stepping out of the prehistory of humankind. So for him, this is all the prehistory, what we have done so far. And if we are able to do this leap, then the real history of humankind could begin. And global citizenship is the way of, let's say, the political expression of the idea of planet Earth, or Tierra Patria, Homeland Earth. We have to overcome this way of thinking always in terms of nation, so as if this would be the natural way of humankind. Yeah, we have to speak instead of world domestic politics. This means to apply all the democratic and justice standards that are in democratic societies, to apply this for the whole world. And this is especially true for me, for my country, for Europe, for the rich countries. We have to overcome what the sociologists call the imperial way of life. This means domination in our way of life, of consumption of all the resources of the rest of the world, which is, of course, not an easy task. Yeah? Why is this possible to speak about global citizenship, and why is it necessary? Yeah? As I have said already, the world becomes smaller and smaller. We have more and more connections, and any politics, any activity, you see it very clearly with the climate crisis, has worldwide effects. What you're doing has effects on many other parts of the world. We're living in an unjust world order. The law of might is the right always. And this is one of the most important challenges we have. So we have to change this. But this is also because of new global opportunities that we can speak about the global citizenship. There are new conditions and better conditions for political participation. Think on the literacy rate, which is much higher than 30 years ago, for instance. Think on the worldwide mobility and communication means that we have. For instance, this conference is an example. And see that there are at least some first steps, I would call it only first steps, to establish a minimal just world order. The United Nations, a good idea, if not always very good in what they're doing in practice. As a General Declaration of Human Rights is a step in this sense. And the things that I believe is the most important in the last years is the emergence of a global civil society, for instance, World Social Forum, international NGOs, and so on. You know, this very well, I guess. Yeah. So if we see that there is already some steps in direction of global citizenship, this is always something that could people encourage to come to work with us and to be also in this group of change makers. So I have here a little table to see what works, what doesn't work. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really focusing on global justice, which has not so much power. The same is at least the idea of United Nations with very relative power means. The International Criminal Court is something like this. And you see, the more I have positive aspects on global justice, the less I have points for the power. A difference is the European Union, which is hardly really an instrument for global justice, but which has, at least at the regional level, much more power. So, and this is a problem, this balance between working for justice and having power, and we have exactly to change this. Okay, I come to the third point, to education and education for Homeland Earth. And I guess we can start with peace education, because peace education from the outset, even in the 19th century already, was an international endeavor. But peace was always understood as world peace, not simply as my little peace in my country or in my home or what else. Yeah. And peace education was always also understood, or mostly understood, as civic education. And it was education for global citizenship avant la lettre, before the notion even appeared. Again, a quotation: peace education must become more action-oriented, educating students for active, responsible global citizenship. So you see this deep connection in the thinking of peace educators between peace education and global citizenship education. You can even put, if you want, global citizenship education in the center, and see that any kind of political education, be it human rights education, be it education for sustainability, be it peace education as such, being education for democracy, for gender equity, and so on. It needs global citizenship education in order to reach this goal. You cannot do this on another level than on the level of global citizenship today. On the other hand, you can also put peace education in the center. It's not about hierarchies where you put it, and you can see that also peace is an indispensable dimension of all these educational aims, because in all these other educational directions, it is also about violence, and peace education is about how to overcome violence. Okay, here I put some common social purposes of peace education and global citizenship education, and it's both a contribution. It wants to be a contribution to a social ecological transformation. It's against nationalism, it's against neoliberalism, it's against neo-colonial structures, and it's against, especially important today, the exploitation of all other beings in the earth and the whole planet Earth itself. Yeah? So this is, again, a common aspect between these two educational approaches. Here I show you only quickly two documents that maybe help to legitimize global citizenship education and peace education. The first one is from the so-called Council of Europe, the Declaration of Maastricht. And here you see that global education is really meant in a global way, so to speak. It is about development education, human rights education, sustainability education, peace education, and so on. So it helps maybe people to do this when they have when it comes to legitimization. And the same is true for the Sustainable Development Goals, who also have a very comprehensive approach to education. As they speak about education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, culture of peace, and so on. So you always see that the trend is to integrate these different educational approaches instead of to divide them into specialize too much. So I think it is very important, this convergence in order to make really a difference. Again, an important third document is the Hague Appeal for Peace statement. This is a civil society statement of 1999, and says a culture of peace. What is it? It will be achieved when citizens of the world understand. I cannot understand what you're saying. Okay, I continue. I'm finalizing now. The aim of global citizenship education is what Morin calls solidarity on this planet and with this planet. What does it mean on this planet, with this planet? It means global citizenship, solidarity among human beings, and planetary citizenship, solidarity with this planet. This means the partnership between the humans and the rest of the whole biosphere. And what Morin says is very important, I guess. We should not seek to pilot, but to co-pilot Earth, a partnership of humanity and nature, of technology and ecology. The Earth commands through life, humankind through consciousness. So I think this is a very good summary of this idea. Another thing I think is important that this global citizenship approach is also against any neo-colonial thinking which exists also within education. It's a criticism of two concepts of the North-South relations. So one, you see one world united without any conflict. This is the logo at left. It comes from UNESCO, and I really disagree because the world is not like this. And you cannot tell students that there is no conflict or there is no problem once we see that we should be united, but we are not united. And the other thing is also coming from the Western world is paternalism. You see on this picture, and this is not ironic, how it mean, that people from the north are helping to the poor people from the south. So, this is very clear that this is also a picture of the world relationship that is not in the sense of global citizenship education. Finally, I come to the last point. I see three ways of transformative education for peace and global citizenship. What schools can do, education within social movements, and adult education. I will only give one example for each of these, and then I will stop for a discussion. What schools can do, of course, you have classroom teaching. This goes without saying. You have, which is much more important, I guess, a whole school approach. When the whole school has defined some objectives and works in the same direction. Or the third one, I think it's even more important. You can make more a difference if you participate in international, or at least in national networks of students, of schools, and of teachers. And one example that is very important, I guess, 15 years ago, in France, they started with the Global Youth Climate Pact, which is now in France, Spain, in the Spanish-speaking world, in Latin America as well, very much popular. And they are also always holding some counter events and parallel events to the climate events and climate summits like this one in Glasgow. So I think I give you here's a website, and I think this is important. And one result of all this is also this open letter to the young people in 4 languages, or in 5 even: Spanish, French, English, German, Portuguese. And this is also an appeal to young people to work for Homeland Earth and to work for a better world. Learning within social movements is very important, and many people, at least in my region, say in schools you cannot do very much because they are too strict in their curricula and too much directed by the state. They cannot do a really genuine transformative education. But without in social movements, it is possible. One example is what I have lived myself, and it was a very touching experience when in Croatia, during the war, there was only one place where this mixed society, Serbs and Croats, where there was no war, and they decided to make a kind of summer school, not a regular school, in order to also to educate the future generations in the idea of peace instead of the war, which was in all other parts of the country. I can tell you more if you want in the discussion. And the second one is, of course, this Fridays for Future movement, which is not only some meetings every Friday, but which is also very much a teaching and learning community, which helps themselves to understand more how to see the world, not simply how to see the climate crisis. And the last one I give you is an example of our own campaign, Homeland Earth, that was started in Austria at the beginning of this year, still ongoing, and which has an appeal, a manifesto, some academic lectures, teaching materials, and even a passport cover. I am citizen of the passport or Earth. You find here template on this homepage. And I think all this together is maybe the best example that general audience should be also reached by this idea of educating for Homeland Earth. This is very important in my opinion. So I thank you so much. I have here at the very last page the idea of this open letter I spoke about just a minute before. And this is a direct appeal to young people that they should engage and they should help themselves to learn and to participate in social movements and to give a response to all disasters in this world. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for this, for your patience to listen to me all the time.
Professor, thank you so much for these insights and these reflections that you share with us today. Professor, we have some questions for this conversation. So one of the concepts that you told us about this reflection from Edgar Morin, it's this Damoclean era. There is a lot of people around the world feeling that this economic disorder, this lack of democracy, it's something that it's just something to be solved by governments. And so the question here is how we can promote more from our schools, from people to participate and to engage in the politics discussion, because sometimes maybe discussing in schools about the things that are happening, like trying to shape the politics, is something that we need to do more. But I don't know if you have any further recommendation for professors and learners who feels that that feeling that maybe it's difficult to change the status quo, Professor.
Mhm. Yeah, this is a very good question, but it's also a very difficult question because I myself, when I worked on the university, now I'm working only in this master program of global citizenship education, and therefore they are all people, of course, are very much engaged. But when I gave some lectures and classes on political education, so students even could choose to come into my class, but they were not politicized at all. And they had very crazy ideas about what is politics. And some people even told me, I'm here now sitting in your class, but I'm not interested in politics, and I don't see what it has to do with myself. Or some people said, yes, I'm interested in politics, but I'm not interested in conflict. And I said, politics is always about conflict. So what I did sometimes was to start a conflict, a mock conflict in the classroom, in order to show them what's the matter and how to. I said, for instance, the rector of the university will give us for this course some 500 euro, and we can decide how to use them. And then I made different proposals, of course. Some people found it just and others not, and I did it unjust for purpose, just to create this conflict, for instance. So at least they understood this. Or I had the chance that in my class were young people, but very old students as well. And the older students, they have had more experience and they were more politicized than the young ones. So this dialogue helped a little bit. So these were two examples. And I think the most important is that you as a teacher are also very convinced of what you're doing, and that you show with your example why we should do this. And then don't believe that you can convince them in 3 days. So work with them for a year or so, and then you will see if there are some differences, if you could make a difference. And sometimes this happened to me, not always, that after a while, when I didn't expect it, then I saw they were changed in some way.
Thanks, Professor. Well, you just told us about, we have some other two questions. One, you just told about the role of the professor. And since we are discussing about education and schools, we also, when we are talking about the future of education, how to promote better education, we focus on students. So I would like, this, my second question is about this continuous education for professors, and how, which should be, well, there is, with this new concept of planetary education, is inviting us to new concepts, new things to think, to reflect, to feel. But I'm, for a professor in some schools, what do you think are the main topics, or if we are, for example, designing a new curriculum, a new process, a new course for professors specifically, what we should teach and to promote to learn for educators?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In some way, this is my specialty, because all of my life work was about train the trainers and teach the teachers. And I believe that this is really very important, because as I said, if the teachers are not engaged enough and if they are not, let's say, competent enough, it doesn't work. I believe that for every teacher, doesn't matter in which subject he is teaching or she is teaching, there is a need to include global citizenship and planetary citizenship education. And I know that there is much resistance against this, maybe not by the teachers themselves, but by other teacher educators, by those who believe that their subject is so important that it is a pity to discuss any other thing. But the fact is that the problem also for students is that all our knowledge is separated into disciplines, and students have to mix it up in their head by themselves, and nobody really gives them a comprehensive view of the world. And I think teaching this is so important, and teachers very often are not able to do this because they themselves are not trained to do this. So I believe in some way, if you want, we need much more philosophy in teacher training. Philosophy not in the sense of dealing with different philosophers and what's their meaning and their ideas, but philosophy in the sense of reflecting the world by yourself and to discover the problems and to make the integration of different parts. This is what Morin calls relier les connaissances, bring together the different kinds of knowledge.
Well, Professor, thank you. There is one last question that we have here, and is regarding teaching about peace. There are some places, there are some schools that are not that close to conflicts, that are not close to wars. So I don't know what are also your thoughts, what you can tell us today about how we can speak about peace, teach about peace to communities that don't have any close conflict in their countries. How to see that reality that it's happening around the world, but that you can see so much close to you.
Mm-hmm. I guess you mean that they think it is not important to us because we are a peaceful community. Yeah. This, of course, is very often the argument against peace education. They say, if there is peace, we don't need it, and if there is war, it doesn't work. I hear this very often. When you say a community where there is no conflict, so I believe there is no community without any conflict. This is not possible because we have always conflict. Of course, it must not be violent conflict, yeah. But we see so much injustice, which we can also call structural violence, for instance. So unjust laws, for instance, or an unfair share of the wealth in our society. There's a gap between the rich and the poor, and all these things. So I believe it is not so difficult to show people that everybody needs peace education. And secondly, peace education is not about or not simply about dealing with conflicts in your private world and being peaceful by yourself. But peace education is also by studying and understanding the global injustices and to find way out and to make proposals for the world or for a greater community. So I think you have to see this in a political sense as well, as I told you before.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Werner Wintersteiner. It's been so a pleasure to hear from you, to hear these reflections of this international encounter. We also thanks to the audience who has watched this conference. And I would like just to, I'm gonna tell it in Spanish, el profesor nos recomienda y está en el material que podemos descargar el libro Tierra Patria de Edgar Morin. Se puede descargar libremente y ahí se encuentran muchas de las reflexiones y algunas de las bases conceptuales de las cuales el profesor nos acaba de compartir hoy acerca de su conferencia. Entonces, a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en esta mañana o en esta tarde en el lugar del mundo donde nos estén viendo. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us. And see you soon. Have a nice day. Muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar en esta conferencia.
Muchas gracias también. And I tell you that Morin has also written a book on 7 complex lessons for education for the future, which I believe is also translated into Spanish. He wrote this for the UNESCO. So you can find this as well. And this is even maybe more practical for teachers. So this is the last word, and thank you so much for inviting me. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego, espero.